Our online lives are being watched, studied, calculated, and by organizations that may surprise us. How do we balance our online security with the need for an open internet? Here now with more on that, Ron Deibert, author of Black Code, Inside the Battle for Cyberspace. He's also director of the Canada Centre for Global Security Studies and the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Sorry, we have no time left now that I've said your title.
You did it well.
Thank you. Ron, good to see you again. Thanks for coming back to TVO.
Thank you for having me.
So the book glows in the dark, eh?
It glows in the dark, scary.
I'm not going to, we can just show the cover there, but it's a very nice orange.
Thank you.
And if we kill the lights right now, it really will glow in the dark?
Maybe we could try.
I don't know if we should. The title Black Code, let's just start right there, because obviously when you think of computers and you got to write code to make it work, but you're not necessarily thinking just of that code, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's a metaphor for several themes that run through the book. I would say one of them, first and foremost, is what I see as a paradox today. As never before, we're surrounded by so much technology. It just is everywhere. It surrounds us. And yet, socially, individually, we know very little about what goes on beneath the surface of that technology. Part of it has to do with it's not immediately present. You know, it's often satellites and fiber optic cables. It's complex. But part of it is also because the technology is shrouded in layers of secrecy and obfuscation. And that's the other reference to Black Code. The three-letter agencies, signals intelligence agencies, national security agencies that were born during the Cold War are assuming more power and authority over cyberspace today. And it was that sense of, you know, black ops, the world of going deep black that I was trying to convey metaphorically through the title.
Tell us a little bit, I mean, we've had you here on the program a number of times, but for those who haven't seen those previous appearances, your work at the Munk School of Global Affairs in the Citizen Lab, what are you up to these days?
Well, the Citizen Lab it's a really unique place. And in fact, there's a funny story about when I started this book. It was really about 10 years ago. And I thought, you know, in order to really understand the world that I wanted to explore, I lacked the technical skills myself to really probe the internet beneath the surface. And I was fortunate to receive a grant from the Ford Foundation to create an interdisciplinary laboratory, and I called it the Citizen Lab. It allowed me to bring together computer scientists, engineers, and others. We've been described as a kind of X-Files meets academia, and that's often how it feels. And it explains why it took me a long time to get back to writing the book, because over the last decade, we've been involved in so many interesting, almost heart-stopping investigations that have led us down dark paths, and that's exhilarating. It's hard to remove yourself from. So every day I wake up, there's a new thing going on. You ask what we're doing right now. I think, generally speaking, what's high on our radar is what I call the cybersecurity industrial complex. And that is the range of companies that have sprouted up, mostly in the defense sector, the intelligence sector, to analyze and provide products and services to government intelligence agencies, censorship, surveillance, even computer network attack capabilities. This is a huge industry, and it's seeping out of the West into the global South, into authoritarian regimes like we saw in the Arab Spring. That's definitely on our radar right now.
When President Eisenhower, and I'm assuming you're kind of doing a bit of a takeoff on his military-industrial complex, when he said it, he didn't mean it as a compliment.
That's right.
He said it was something to be feared. In the same way, should we be fearing the cybersecurity industrial complex?
I think so. I think, I don't want to be alarmist about it. I think it's important to understand that, you know, the private sector plays an important role in cyberspace. We need companies that are agile, flexible, that are able to secure networks. I think it's best if that comes from the private sector. But there's a kind of unintended consequence to this where as governments have ramped up offensive capabilities and have begun to focus their security concerns around monitoring entire populations, of course that affects the industry. They start offering products and services that policymakers never before imagined. Cell phone tracking, deep packet inspection, commercialized spyware, ways to infiltrate your computers and spy on you. And it's very difficult to control that market. Once it starts, there's a kind of momentum and an inertia to it. So you see a dynamic where the desire for more data feeds a kind of, at a policy level, regulations being relaxed to allow law enforcement and intelligence to access data about us. But then also in the hands of authoritarian, nasty regimes, they can be used in ways that are unaccountable against their own population. That's what we should be concerned about.
And let's clarify, as I think you do in the book, that the work that you do at the Citizen Lab, when you're, and I say this affectionately, when your nerds get behind their computers and start doing their digging, they're not doing anything illegal, right? They are just following legal channels in cyberspace to uncover malfeasance, potentially.
It's definitely important to clarify that point. It's often exaggerated. For a long time, I think there was an easy description that people use, hackers in the basement at the Citizen Lab, and people assume that, you know, simply because of the term hacker, we were doing something wrong. In fact, it's entirely the opposite. From the very beginning, we've recognized, A, that we were in kind of terra incognito. So by that I mean, what do you do as a university researcher when you stumble upon millions of personally identifiable chats that Skype has collected without users' permission and given to the Chinese security service, and you happen to surf to a website and locate them? What do you do with them? I mean, this is ethical, legal, all sorts of questions bound up with that. But B, we really thought through this carefully. We recognized that we were in uncharted territory and have, up to including today, thought through very carefully not only the legal issues, but ethical issues, because there are no laws that cover a lot of this. And so we have to be responsible. And of course, we answer to the University of Toronto's Research Ethics Board. So we're definitely not cavalier cowboys. That said, we still use some very innovative technical interrogation forensic methods that are profoundly powerful to do what we do.
What's the GhostNet?
GhostNet was the name that we gave to a cyber espionage campaign that we discovered in 2009. It emerged through our research of Tibetan communities in northern India, the office of the Dalai Lama. They suspected that their computers were being monitored by the Chinese, so they had heard about us and invited us up to collect data, forensic data on their computers. We analyzed it, and in the course of the investigation, one of the lead technical researchers, Nart Villeneuve, really stumbled across, accidentally, a mistake made on the part of the attackers that allowed him to see their entire command and control interface. And through that window, we were able to understand that, lo and behold, they had compromised the Tibetans, but they had also compromised hundreds of government agencies, departments of foreign affairs, embassies, prime ministers' offices, companies. It was truly, I think, one of the first landmark cyber espionage reports, and for that reason, really put us on the map.
And the front page of the New York Times, if I remember as well.
Front page of the New York Times, and I think the biggest story on that day in 2009.
So who done it?
Well, you know, that we weighed very carefully. I think the obvious answer to a lot of people, well, it's China. And although that's an easy answer, it's not a careful one. And again, this gets back to being, you know, very judicious about how we approach what we do. We wanted to weigh all the possible alternatives. The fact of the matter is that having kind of that window into what the attackers were doing without the attackers' knowledge, knowing all of the victimized computers in that way, if we were unethical, we could have taken that information and sold it to the highest bidder. We could have done it ourselves. And we wanted to illustrate that point in the GhostNet report, that although it appears to be China, it's not so simple. Attribution is very difficult in cyberspace because attackers can hide their tracks.
Did you ever hear from the Dalai Lama on that?
Well, not the Dalai Lama himself. The Dalai Lama responded on that day through CNN, and that was very bizarre to watch CNN and hear the Chinese government saying we're liars, and the Dalai Lama saying I have no secrets to hide. And but to this day, in fact, there was a Tibetan in the Citizen Lab who is collaborating with us on the research. We've maintained very good links with the Tibetan communities, not because we're necessarily Buddhists or anything like that, but they have been at the front lines, obviously facing a determined adversary, and they've not had anyone else to go to. They don't have a lot of money, and that, I think, illustrates the kind of focus that we have on the Citizen Lab. We don't service government agencies or the private sector. We work with human rights organizations, and the Tibetans have been steady participants in the research going back to that time.
Their computer works were clearly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. The average person's also as vulnerable?
Well, I think, you know, there is this malaise of cybercrime that affects just about everyone in some way at some time. It's hard to escape from it. The question is whether the same techniques of cybercrime, the same vulnerabilities that might be on all of our computers that lead to criminal exploitation, are used by determined attackers to target you for something other than, say, financial motivation. I think that as a society, we've gone through this enormous sea change in how we communicate. You know, people talk about 20 years, this big information revolution. I think the big change has really been in the last 5 with mobile and social networking and cloud computing. We've essentially turned our digital lives inside out. And as a consequence of that, there are just more traces of us. We're exposed in so many ways. And that naturally leads to the possibilities of criminal exploitation.
Are most people, do you think, aware of the fact that they are leaving this footprint behind?
No, I think part of the rationale in writing the book was to, as I said, lift the lid on the internet. I think if you broaden it out from just criminal risk to what we don't know about cyberspace as a whole, it's quite remarkable. The way I like to think about it is to ask people to try to understand what happens when you send that text message or you make a tweet. What happens physically? Yeah, that information goes through a vast, complex physical infrastructure. Most of the data is entrusted to third parties, usually private companies. Who has access to that data? Well, as we're finding out now with the NSA scandal, it could be many different agencies. And I think there's a kind of, I wouldn't say ignorance is not the right word, but most people just accept the technology at face value, assume it's just a special kind of magic that works, when in fact power is exercised beneath the surface of cyberspace. And if we want to make sure that our rights are protected, if we want to ensure that we live in a healthy, liberal, democratic society, we need to peel back the layers and get at where power is being exercised.
Well, this was something I learned from the book. The University of Toronto, where you work, in the middle of downtown Toronto, an email being sent from that campus to the Hockey Hall of Fame, which is maybe, I don't know what, 5 subway stops south. That feels like a fairly short distance for an email to go. Mm-hmm. In fact, what happens?
Well, what you're pointing to is a project from colleagues of mine at the University of Toronto at IX Maps, and what they showed through thousands of trace routes of emails that they did systematically is that the vast majority of emails transiting within Toronto likely pass through internet exchange points in the United States. So that email traveling from University of Toronto to the Hockey Hall of Fame probably goes through Chicago and likely into a facility where the NSA has special eavesdropping equipment. As Canadians, we are entirely dependent on the United States for our communications. And that affects us directly because we have no input as citizens into what goes on in terms of protections for civil liberties and so on in the United States. And worse, as we found out with the NSA scandal, we're actually categorized as foreigners. There's a big debate down there. Well, they're collecting information on Americans. Well, no, it's just targeted at foreigners. Well, that's you
us.
And me, yes.
So those people who think right now that sending an email across town, somehow they're protected from all of this national security agency eavesdropping in the United States, they should not feel so secure. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And in fact, going further than that, I think, you know, the Google Docs you use, if you use Gmail, if you search through Google, even if you use encryption, it turns out one of the latest documents that was leaked by Edward Snowden pointed out that if you use encryption, the NSA is able to retain that data indefinitely until they can crack it. You have to assume that you go about your daily lives communicating through all these different applications, services, through this complex infrastructure. It's owned and operated by some private company. Those private companies are domiciled in some jurisdiction and subject to the laws of that country in which they're domiciled.
A lot of these applications that we enjoy using and sign up for and certainly don't read the 25 pages of fine print that you have to agree to before using these products. Let's get a better understanding of what we are actually signing up to, because the Facebook app for Google's Android operating system allows them, by agreement, you've checked off the box,
right,
allows them to do what?
Well, most of them allow themselves to access things like your contact book, your text messages, sometimes even the phone calls that you've made, the camera, including the image that it's focusing on at the moment, maybe even the microphone. Of course, all of these are put in place not because they're looking to spy on you as a person in some nefarious way. They're looking to track your activities and understand your social networks so that they can better advertise towards you, direct advertisement towards you, and that's how they derive revenues from things they give away for free. The problem is, of course, all that information is then somewhere. When you think about the number of applications, I heard a statistic recently. Apple announced they've crossed the threshold of 50 billion apps. 50 billion apps. That's like 7 for every person on Earth. Yeah. Each of those apps gives itself permission along the lines of what we're talking about and sends information to those companies' servers, which are located somewhere physically. And so the data is accessible not only to that company, but to any law enforcement or intelligence agency under whose jurisdiction that company operates, right? So we're disaggregating ourselves voluntarily, and yet we haven't thought through how we should constitute our society to make sure that that isn't abused.
So, all right, again, just to be clear here, if I buy a book about hockey off Amazon, next time I go onto the Amazon site, they're going to offer me 4 other options on hockey books I could buy.
Right.
That doesn't feel too nefarious.
Feels good, probably.
Probably, might have offered me an option of something that I didn't know about that I might be interested in.
Yeah.
But there's a flip side to that, you're saying, which is?
Well, the flip side is that all of that data is not only collected by Amazon, it's also accessible to, say, the National Security Agency, or in our country, the Communications Security Establishment, potentially. We're not sure about that. But let's just say to CSEC, to law enforcement, to intelligence agencies, to the government. And individually, bits of information may not mean much, but when they're collected and collated and used in such a way as to profile you, if the government is corrupt, or if it directs those capabilities toward stifling dissent, then we have a real problem. So it's not that surveillance in and of itself even is a bad thing. Certainly not that Amazon's tailoring its products to you. I think that's a great convenience. It's that we need to understand and not lose sight of the importance of oversight and checks and balances when it comes to government in relation to all of this data, and the private sector.
Somebody observed the other day that if Facebook, for example, were a country with 1 billion people, it would be the 3rd biggest country in the world. Right. We have the option not to connect to that country. We can just not join. So for those people who want to say, watch out, the sky is falling here, we do have an option not to get sucked into all this, don't we? Is that a viable option? Not
really. I think individually we can say, and I heard many people do this, I don't have a Facebook account, for example. You can choose to remove yourself from certain product lines and services, but ultimately we live in a collective society that's shaped by the ecosystem of communications, and it's very difficult to remove yourself from that entirely. Credit cards, ATM machines, Netflix accounts, and so on, surveillance cameras, even what we're doing right now. My mobile phone, even when I'm not using it, is emitting a pulse every few seconds containing metadata about the make of the phone, the geolocation, the timestamp, and that it's my phone. So we're secreting this data constantly. Furthermore, I think it's wrong-headed to see the solution as removing ourselves from it. I know many people like to complain about it as this is, I don't like the internet, I don't like the all of these applications and so on. There are downsides to it, but let's not forget, ultimately this is about you and I being able to communicate with each other in an unfettered manner and access the same information no matter where we are on the planet. I think that is not only very cool, I think it's essential to the survival, the long-term survival of the species. So we can't go back to a time prior to this. If we did, I think it would be ruinous. We have to live within it, but think about the political architecture within which it's all contained. That's important.
Disconnecting is not the solution. The solution is to make sure that the connection is safer.
Exactly, yeah.
Let me read you something that Rebecca McKinnon, whom you know, wrote. This is going back a year now in Consent of the Network, and I'll get your view on this. She writes, in the physical world, mechanisms of democratic politics and constitutional law have worked, not perfectly, but still far better than any alternatives, to protect citizens' rights. But these mechanisms are no longer adequate for people whose physical lives now depend on what they can and cannot do, and what others can do to them, in the new digital spaces where sovereignty and power are ill-defined and highly contested. The reality is that corporations and governments that build, operate, and govern cyberspace are not being held sufficiently accountable for their exercise of power over the lives and identities of people who use digital networks. They are sovereigns operating without the consent of the networked. Your view?
Well, Rebecca and I share the same lament on that, that's for sure. I think that when it comes to companies, we have to understand that at least 95% of all of this stuff that we call cyberspace is owned by the private sector. And furthermore, companies like Google, Facebook, especially Twitter, our cell phone companies and providers, know a lot about what we do, what our habits are, our preference, our social networks. That's really quite a dramatic shift in how we interact with the private sector. I don't think that there is enough accountability in that regard. You know, my basic message in this book, and it's similar to Rebecca's, is that we need to think through political accountability in the digital age. It's not going to be an easy conversation, but I think it's one that we desperately need to have. I think we've gone through this big revolutionary change in the ecosystem of communications at the very same time that these security agencies are being entrusted with more power and authority. It's one thing that Rebecca doesn't quite pick up upon, I think, that needs to be underlined here. These are mammoth agencies that were born during the Cold War. They've operated in the shadows for a long time. In the old days, their activities were mostly focused on each other in a kind of spy versus spy game. 9/11 dramatically changed all of that. You'll remember that the issue there was a failure to connect the dots.
Yes.
And so now they've desperately sought to rectify that by turning inward on all of us at the very same time that we're turning our digital lives inside out. So that needs to be discussed directly, and I think almost at a constitutional level. So it's even a higher level of accountability that concerns me than just with the corporations.
But this stuff seems so powerful, and frankly, political leaders seem quite, I mean, this is complicated stuff, right? In some respects, our political leadership may not have the, the background and the experience to deal with this. How would you propose that we deal with this?
I think there needs to be a great deal of awareness raising, first of all. It's ironic to some extent. I start the book by saying that if I ask most people in Canada if they've heard of the Communications Security Establishment, they'd shrug. And that was, I used to begin public lectures by asking people, have you heard of the RCMP? Yes. CSIS? Yes. CSEC? No. Now people have heard about it. So it's a great opportunity to start asking, well, what exactly does this agency do? What are the oversight mechanisms? What is its role and mission and so on? The problem is that they've operated with such secrecy for so long, part of it justified, let's be clear about that, that there is very little public understanding of the proper role in relation to the rest of government and society.
Yeah, we do want them to catch terrorists after all, right?
It is a nasty world. There's a lot of bad stuff going on. We do need law enforcement and we need intelligence agencies, in my opinion. It's just making sure that they operate within a rigorous framework of accountability. The other thing I would add is that there's a long-term issue at stake here. The vast majority of the internet users today aren't from Canada or the United States or Europe. They're from the global south. Asia makes up about 47% of the internet population, but it ranks only 6th by region in terms of connectivity. That means there's this huge population that has yet to come online, that is coming online very quickly. But they're coming online in the context of countries that are failed or fragile states, autocratic, authoritarian regimes. If we don't get it right here in Canada, in the United States, then we have very little hope of persuading those countries to follow the basic principles that we think should govern society down the road. In fact, the revelations of NSA, I believe, have accelerated a movement away from that abroad.
If we haven't completely terrified people today, we certainly will tomorrow, because we're going to come talk about cybercrime and cyber warfare tomorrow.
Great.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.